Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is the last for now segment of our multi-part series on everything sustainability and compliance. We've done a number of sessions on CP, EcoVadis, etc., SBTI, and today we are talking about the California Climate Accountability Package, SB 253 and SB 261, and how companies can move from compliance, ideally, to strategic advantage. I am Corinne Hansen. I'm the VP of Sustainability at Green Places, and I'm joined by my colleague, Andrew Rizkala, our Director of Sustainability Reporting. We'll get started in just a moment as folks continue to join. And in the meantime, we'd love to hear where you're joining us from. This is our typical question here, so sorry if you're sick of it. Drop your location in the chat, and we'll make sure we officially kick off about 2 minutes past the hour. I like keeping this question because I like seeing some familiar faces, and I like playing the game of who's coming from farthest away, who's still curious about the California Climate Accountability Package. Excellent. Okay, Clearwater, Florida, current winner. Uh,
Halifax. Wow.
Fantastic. Okay, we're up on 2 minutes past, and I know we've got a bunch of slides to get through today, so let's dive in. Welcome to our quick and focused webinar on California's Climate Accountability Package. We're really leaning into this new format, 30 minutes, packed with as many insights as we can possibly give you. So appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day. But yeah, let's go ahead and just jump right in. I said before quickly, but my name is Corinne Hansen. I am our VP of Sustainability here at Green Places. And I'm joined today by Andrew Rizkala, our Director of Sustainability Reporting. Riz, do you want to say a quick hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Corinne. Excited to be here again for our fourth Webby. And hello to everyone. Thanks for joining today. I think whether you've been in the sustainability game for a while or you're just getting started, you're in the right place. We're gonna today help you get the most out of your preparation for California's landmark climate statutes, SB 253 and 261. And that means understanding the regulations themselves and how to turn what might be viewed as a necessary compliance exercise into a useful strategic advantage for your company. So let's dive in.
So here's our agenda for today. We'll begin with a refresher on SB 261 and its alignment with the TCFD framework. We'll review the latest updates and rulemaking processes, and then shift into what meaningful preparation looks like and how clients are preparing today. We'll make sure we leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But I know we've talked a lot about SB 253, and we could definitely touch on it in more detail at the close or in the Q&A, but we're going to really focus on 261 for now since it's coming up quick and we know there are a lot of questions. Okay, so SB 261 in 2023, the California Climate Accountability Package. In 2023, California passed both SB 253 and SB 261, creating a two-pronged accountability framework. Emissions disclosure under SB 253 and climate-related financial risk reporting under SB 261. These are now law. Amendments in 2024 through SB 219 didn't really change anything about the core requirements, but did offer some administrative clarity, which is something that's kind of badly needed on this front. We're going to go a little bit deeper, as I mentioned, into SB 261 today, as the requirements are a little bit less well-defined than those around the greenhouse gas emissions reporting. So we do know, and we've heard from lots of you already, that there's a desire for more clarification there. And so for SB 261, let's talk a little bit about why the state of California adopted this requirement for companies to assess and disclose climate-related risks. So starting in December 2022, a series of atmospheric rivers caused widespread flooding across the state, resulting in power outages, transportation disruptions, and $4.6 billion in damages. We saw another massive rainstorm flood LA and San Diego, causing over $30 million in damages and disrupting real estate, construction companies with delays and unplanned repairs. The state has also seen significant wildfires, the LA wildfires last year, $34 billion in losses. And so sort of against that backdrop that SB 261 was passed in 2023. with an aim to help organizations improve their resilience by undertaking climate risk related assessments and communicating their findings. We know that there's real, tangible financial risk associated with the impacts of climate change. The idea here is to take what has already been established as a positive exercise under TCFD and sort of consolidate it under regulations and make it a requirement for companies to have to do these assessments. So diving a little bit into TCFD, because this has been the piece of voluntary framework that has been adopted and consolidated under 261, there are really four pillars of TCFD, which SB 261 is explicitly aligned with. You'll see them echoed in the rest of this presentation, and we'll talk in detail about them. They are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So it's not just sustainability reporting, it's enterprise risk management that's adjusted to be focused on climate. So governance, really how your board and management oversee climate risks. Strategy, which is your short, medium, and long-term plans around climate risks. Risk assessment, or in other words, the processes you have in place to identify and manage those climate risks. And metrics and targets. So how you quantify your risks and your company's goals for improvement. So for California's climate accountability package, the risks are broken down into two major types. And you should see this as sort of familiar. This is the same kind of language that's used around how do we understand risks in terms of climate. We need to understand both physical risks, wildfires, floods, heat waves, things like that. So like real weather associated risks and transition risks like carbon pricing, regulation, shifting markets, reputational damage. The challenge is really quantifying these in the way that can actually inform business decisions. So that's what SB 261 is pushing companies toward. Um, and before we get fully into the weeds on this, i.e., that like application of how this can make sense for businesses and what will be disclosed, let's talk about some recent updates. I know we're all on the edge of our seats waiting for CARB to share some of those definitions. And for that, I will hand it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Corinne. And yeah, I think you said it well. At this point, all eyes are on the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. This is the enforcement authority for both SB 253 and 261. And while full guidance is still in development, CARB has signaled that good faith efforts will be taken into account with the release of an enforcement notice in December 2024 that demonstrated a bent toward leniency for the first round of disclosures. Now, companies are encouraged to use what they have, so that might mean prior fiscal year data if 2025 data isn't available, for example, in 2026, when reporting emissions. CARB has also signaled during its recent virtual public workshop in May that the rulemaking process will extend until the end of the year in order to take public comments into consideration and to provide additional clarity beyond the statute text. I know many of us were anticipating rulemaking update in July, but since the virtual public workshop in May, it seems that this will certainly go through the end of the year. Now, referring back to that enforcement notice and a comment period that opened at the end of last year, there was a lot of engagement during the comment period. Everything from how to define who's in scope to how to structure reporting cycles. So CARB is now kind of in their pre-rulemaking, holding workshops and refining the final rules. And then some of the considerations that popped up during the most recent virtual public workshop included things as fundamental as who will be covered and what will be required. In the statute, it references doing business in California. Specifically, what section of the Revenue and Tax Code is going to be referenced for that. The staff at CARB is favoring Section 23101. There's a little bit of clarity needed around what meaningful economic activity really means. As an example, comments address the point of, is the presence of a remote employee in California sufficient to prove doing business in California? Because while we know payroll is one of the three options to prove doing business, remote work is somewhat varied. And there's a strong push from the public to say that, well, remote employees maybe shouldn't count. In addition, clearly articulating the definition of revenue, as in where do the thresholds mentioned in the text apply at the parent or subsidiary level? Again, CARB is favoring the definition of gross receipts as set forth in the California Revenue and Tax Code, Section 25120. But we have yet to see really the formal rule on this. And then finally, relationships between parent and subsidiary companies. So CARB staff are considering, whether to leverage cap and trade regulation that's currently enforced to define corporate association using degree of ownership or control over another entity. A level of ownership or control of 50%, for example, or greater would require establishment of a corporate association, which would then trigger the reporting threshold. But again, they're giving us, some notes on where they're headed, but we don't yet know the final rule. Despite all of this, Senator Weiner, who was the lead sponsor of these climate laws, did say on the virtual public workshop that the timetables are holding firm for Scope 1 and 2 in 2026 and Scope 3 in 27 and climate risk reporting in 26. So as much as we expect more clarity in the second half of the year, and we will continue to attend these rulemaking sessions and provide updates, but we think it will extend through the end of the year. So now we want to kind of talk through how are companies actually preparing? Because it's one thing to look at the framework and the pillars and understand the points, but let's look at what this could look like in action at companies. So in terms of preparations for compliance on the governance side, companies are updating board committee charters, they're assigning executive ownership, and they're embedding climate KPIs into business planning. So governance really can't be vague. CARB wants to see formal rules, roles, and documented oversight. And really, this is a leadership issue, not just a sustainability one. So having that delineation between the board and management and using the committee structures that are currently in place is a great way to get started. On strategy, firms are clarifying their planning horizons and they're updating risk assessments to feed into long-term business planning. Things like supply chain policies, vendor expectations, real estate strategies can all be implicated and reworked to reflect climate dependencies as they arise from risk assessments. On the risk management front, companies are definitely retooling enterprise risk systems to the extent that they have them to include climate. And that means revisiting insurance, business continuity plans, and maybe site-specific vulnerabilities. It may also mean integrating those findings into board and management level reporting. Something that we are seeing a pretty large demand for is climate-specific physical and transition risk assessments. So going back to the physical and transition risks that Corinne mentioned earlier, taking a deep dive look at the locations that the company either leases or owns, and looking at data that's available on forecasted impacts, physical events that may occur, like wildfires and giant rainstorms that were mentioned earlier, in those locations, both the likelihood and the impact and severity of those um, risks into the future, right? So there needs to be some forecasting as well against some different scenarios for that. And then on metrics and targets, this is where SB 253 and 261 really start to intersect. So emissions data, energy use, target setting will all need to be kind of traceable and defensible and included in the reporting. Um, Clients are really using this time to revisit their scope 1, 2, and relevant scope 3 emissions inventories and preparing for assurance requirements. But also kind of looking at what's previously been communicated. If prior climate reporting has been completed through voluntary means like the CDP or EcoVadis or other industry-specific platforms, maybe leveraging those metrics to include in CARB reporting on other environmental topics like wastewater or energy, or potentially incorporating customer-specific requirements where maybe companies have committed to service level reductions of emissions. Potentially communicating those publicly is an option for this section. So at Green Places, we guide our clients through a complete climate risk assessment that's aligned with the SB 261 and TCFD frameworks. So that includes the physical and transition risk analysis, the governance planning, target setting, and scenario analysis. And really, our goal is not just compliance, but coming up with an actionable and defensible strategy.
Thanks, Riz. Okay, so I think we've finally done it. We've made it through our slides with enough time to actually answer Q&A. And so I just want to direct folks to the chat or to the Q&A option. Either is fine. Please feel free to drop your questions about either SB253 or SB261 directly in there. Um, and then I'll just say two things. One, the one question that we have in here so far, it's now two questions, is whether or not slides will be shared. Absolutely. In the slide deck itself, we have a longer explanation of our full scope of work. I think that that's helpful, even if you're just kind of trying to figure out how do we meet these targets, how do we satisfy SB 261 to sort of understand the flow of work. But for the purposes of this call, I won't go back to that in too much detail, but that is also in there for reference. But absolutely, we'll share that. The other thing I'll say, just as we start to have questions trickle in a little bit, is that we bring up the fact that there isn't enough guidance from the law itself or from CARB because there is a requirement in California and federally, but in California, for there to be sort of a completeness and satisfy a requirement around not being vague in order for companies to be able to implement. And so there is concern that not only will companies not know how to satisfy these requirements, but that there will be challenges and the law could potentially be struck down. So we do expect to see that and happy to answer more questions about this in particular. But CARB knows, everyone knows that there will need to be further guidance about how to apply TCFD in a more uniform way versus leaning on best practice and what companies have done, which has been completely acceptable when it's been a voluntary standard. Um, I don't know, Riz, if you want to say anything else about that before we dive into Q&A.
No, I think that's right. There's been varied implementation in the past of TCFD, and there is yet still a lot of clarity needed for how deep companies should be planning to go here. But I always go back to the importance here is for this to be a planning um, event for a company, and it's also to communicate what the company is doing. And certainly we should be honest and truthful in our disclosures with respect to what is actually in place. Um, but to the extent that you can prepare some, um, assessments and undergo some, risk management practices that shore up your disclosure ahead of time, I think that, we've got 6 months to do that. So why not take the time to do that?
Exactly, yeah. Um, okay, I'll start with our webinar chat and I'll turn over to our Q&A. First question, Riz, we were just talking about this around leniency from CARB and expectations there. How are you explaining to companies that are resistant to go through spending on risk scenarios that this is a critical part of the compliance? Is it in fact important for companies to spend and rush for their first disclosure in 2026, or is this where CARB will be lenient?
Look, my perspective on this is it's a worthwhile exercise. And I would actually point to the CSRD, if you're familiar in the EU. There's a number of topics that were proposed for disclosure. And E1, which includes climate, is assumed to be universally material to all companies. And so I think in that backdrop, that's how you have to think about this is it is very unlikely that there are no climate risks that are relevant to your company. Um, and obviously, there's analysis and assessment that you should do to back that up. But um, this, we are all living on the same planet, and climate affects all of us. And so, certain locations we will see higher risk than others with certain physical aspects. But I think that the question here, is it important for companies to rush their first disclosure? I wouldn't say rush it. I think take the time now, use this as a sort of forcing mechanism to go do the risk assessment and be prepared for this disclosure because frankly this is the first, but it's not going to be the last. There's 5 or 6 additional states that have, similar language working through their legislative process to be published. So I don't see um, I if I were in charge, I would not wait. I would go ahead and do it.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think risk assessment and scenario analysis as well are is sort of like the backbone to SB 261. So I would expect this to be the likely the least lenient part of SB 261. That said, it's not asking, at least in its current iteration, for perfection. And I think there is an understanding that meaningful risk assessments take months, not weeks. And so disclosure of the law, in its intent, when it was disclosed, it was made clear that this would be required, is such that companies should already be working on this now. If you're just starting, you do still have time, of course, and happy to help you with that. But the intent here is that you not do perfect work of your risk assessment, but that you demonstrate that you are doing the work toward risk assessment. So where I would expect leniency is in, sort of the success of your risk assessment. That if you need to get something done this year, that's probably more passable in this first year, but omitting that component of it certainly won't be. Um, I will also say that, like I said before, risk scenarios take months to do, well, not weeks. So pushing this off further probably means that you're going to end up spending more to do the corrections to process. So I also wouldn't necessarily advocate for folks kind of like skipping it and taking a fine in this first year. I would make the effort to demonstrate that you're taking action here um, to avoid that.
Agree.
Um, Next question, if you're only applicable for SB 261 and not SB 253, do you have to disclose your scope 1 and 2 emissions? I think the short answer here is it's challenging to do a full risk assessment without understanding your emissions, but not impossible. And I do think that demonstrating similar intent to understand your emissions in the long term without having done it yet is passable in year one. That's what we expect, but that will be meaningful to do that as part of your core risk assessment going forward. I think the key forcing function and difference here is around disclosure, right? If you do that assessment and you include details from having done that assessment in your risk assessment, it will be a stronger assessment than if you omitted them, but you don't necessarily need to disclose the complete full inventory if for whatever reason there's concern in your company to do so. Um, If green places assist, can they also do limited assurance? So if you are the one who is conducting the footprint, you cannot also be the one who assures the footprint. You need sort of a separate body to do that. And so we work with a lot of partners who do the assurance work. So happy to refer you to any of those partners. But we do footprints conducted in a way that will be sort of compliant with limited or reasonable assurance. So we go through the assurance process with you and with whatever partner selected. There's sort of like an ethical challenge to doing both the footprint and the assurance of it. Next question, is a financial materiality assessment a must for a company that hasn't done one before in order to be compliant, or is their best faith effort without that process enough? Riz, I'll let you crack this
Yeah,
one.
good question. I honestly, the answer is we need CARB to really weigh in on this, but my perspective on this is I've seen a range of TCFD disclosures prepared, and not all of them have included um, financial, quantitative aspects of their risk assessment. Some have been qualitative. And often there is a maturity curve of the first time you go through this, you end up with a more qualitative output, and then you get to the point where you're integrating kind of more FP&A style financial forecasting to get to where you can actually put a number on what you anticipate the severity and impact of some of these risks to be. And then that can help you in the long run kind of prepare mitigation steps, right? But given that this is new for a lot of companies, um, and given CARB has signaled leniency here, I think that if, the company is looking at this and saying, hey, I've only got so much time and budget here, what can I focus on? I think getting to the actual financial, impacts of the risks, I could see that being something that you push out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, Question about the reporting deadline for SB 253, and we can either throw that slide back up, or Rose, you can just speak to it.
Yeah, on 253, we know 2026. We also know, having been through greenhouse gas inventory preparation with many, many clients, that this is not something that happens in the first 3 weeks of the year. So a January 1 requirement on emissions is not really plausible. CARB in their public workshop did talk about the potential to require alignment with a company's fiscal year. It also talked about maybe an offset of 3 to 6 months from the beginning of the year. This is yet to be determined, frankly. So, but if you're worried about the January 1 deadline, that really uniquely applies to the climate risk assessment and not necessarily the emissions inventory.
Yeah. I'll also say that too, we're looking at scope 1 and 2 emissions requirements in 2026 and then scope 3 emissions in 2027. So there is a bit of a distinction and sort of a easier lift in year one around disclosure. That is definitely the big piece that we're kind of on the edge of our seats about here. Um, Great, excellent response. Thank you, folks, for helping one another in the chat. That's fantastic. Can the climate risk assessment findings from a double materiality assessment for CSRD be repurposed in SB 261? I think Riz, you sort of touched on this already.
Yeah, absolutely. As part of your kind of impacts, risks, opportunities analysis during your DMA, you would have come to a list of relevant risks. And I would start there with your climate risk disclosure potentially. And, there's an opportunity to go deeper depending on, aspects of the DMA that were covered, the double materiality assessment. But certainly you could get deeper with kind of the financial impacts of those risks. But that is a great place to start. Yeah.
I see a question about besides California, are there other states coming up with similar reporting requirements? Or do we need to keep our eyes on? The short answer is yes, of course. The long answer, for the purposes of time here, will point you to our reporting radar on our website. You can go and type in the information of your company and get sort of a long list of the international and domestic laws and regs to pay attention to. We did just see some like non-movement on bills in New York that we've been looking towards. So it's definitely a shifting landscape and one that we understand is tough to keep on top of. Um, and then quickly, we're a subsidiary of a larger company. Can our parent company provide reasonable assurance, or do we need an outside company for this?
Uh, yeah, no, you would want arm's length on that. So another entity.
Um, and then is scenario analysis required? Is a question coming to us from the Q&A itself. Um, Again, short answer is yes. I think this is probably a part where there would be some leniency. Do you rely on the right models and have you done this correctly if you're doing this yourself? I do expect there to be some leniency and further guidance provided, but looking at longer term scenario analysis is a pretty big important part of TCFD and something that will want to be leaned on for the purposes of SB 261.
Yeah.
Um, and then again, really quickly, I want to make sure we get to this doing business in California question. So, emissions, does the report need to include emissions data or can it point to the SB 253 disclosure? I do think that you don't necessarily need to include express emissions reporting in SB 261. It's not necessarily required of TCFD. Um, I wouldn't, though, say to count on pointing to your SB 253 disclosure. I would include as much detail as possible if you have it. Um, it's hard for us to say at this point how it'll be analyzed. And maybe our last question, can you discuss doing business in California a bit more? Does a consulting firm or law firm with no California physical office doing business in California, if it generates a certain amount of revenue in California, sort of count for the purposes of this? Um, but-
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Would point you to the revenue and tax code because that's what they're leaning on right now, and there are inflation adjusted thresholds that are published there. So if you have property to the tune of $74,000, or if you have compensation or payroll to the tune of about $74,000, or if you have sales in the state to 735,000, then you are ostensibly doing business in California. So it really is regardless of whether you have, people.
Absolutely. And I would expect that to be more clearly defined, but I can't imagine they would choose a separate definition there. Excellent. Okay. Thank you everybody so much for joining today. I know we're just over time and apologies if we missed any other questions. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you would like some support and for us to answer any other questions. We will happily send out these slides to everyone who attended or didn't attend and was registered. And there is a link in the chat to our regulation radar, but we'll make sure that's included as well. But thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for the thoughtful questions and good luck out there in reporting season.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Bye, everyone.
Bye.